The morning Marcus Hendricks told me that real men don't complain about workplace conditions was the same morning I realized my 15 years of loyalty to Pinnacle Manufacturing had been fundamentally misplaced. I'd walked into his corner office with my third formal report in 2 months, each one more detailed than the last, each one documenting the same escalating safety violations across our production floor. He barely glanced at the papers before sliding them back across his desk with that particular expression supervisors get when they've already made up their minds about something. What he said next revealed everything I needed to know about how this company actually viewed the people who kept their operations running. He leaned back in his chair, fixed me with what he probably thought was a meaningful stare, and informed me that real men don't run to management every time they encounter a little workplace discomfort. Real men, according to Marcus, find ways to work around problems instead of creating paperwork about them. I stood there for a moment, holding my report, watching him tap his pen against his coffee mug with the kind of rhythmic certainty that suggested this conversation was already over in his mind. The interesting thing about that moment wasn't my anger, though I certainly felt it. The interesting thing was how clearly I suddenly understood the position I'd been maneuvering myself into for months without fully realizing it. You see, when you've spent 15 years as a production floor supervisor, you develop certain instincts about machinery, about safety protocols, about the small signs that indicate larger problems brewing beneath the surface. Those instincts had been working overtime lately, cataloging issues that seemed to be multiplying faster than our maintenance department could address them. And when those instincts tell you that people are going to get hurt, you document everything. You create paper trails. You follow proper channels. What I hadn't fully appreciated until that morning was how those proper channels could be used against you when the people controlling them decided your concerns were inconvenient. Marcus continued his lecture about workplace resilience in team players, while I made a series of calculations that would prove, in the coming weeks, to be remarkably prescient. I calculated how many of my incident reports had been filed but never acted upon. I calculated how many times maintenance requests had been delayed or ignored entirely. I calculated the gap between what our safety manual required and what actually happened on our production floor every single day. Most importantly, I calculated exactly what kind of documentation would be most useful to someone conducting an external safety inspection. When Marcus finished explaining how real men handle workplace challenges, I thanked him for his time, collected my report, and returned to the production floor with a clarity of purpose that felt almost liberating. Sometimes the most important moments in your career arrive disguised as routine conversations with middle management. The production floor at Pinnacle Manufacturing stretched across nearly 40,000 square feet of concrete and steel, divided into 6 primary workstations that processed everything from basic metal stamping to complex assembly operations. I'd supervised various sections of this floor for most of my career here, which meant I knew every machine, every safety protocol, and every shortcut that workers developed when management pressure made those protocols inconvenient. It also meant I knew exactly which violations would catch the attention of federal safety inspectors. The hydraulic press in Station 3 had been operating with a faulty safety interlock for 6 weeks. The interlock system was designed to prevent the press from cycling when the light curtain detected movement in the danger zone. But somewhere along the line, someone had installed a bypass switch that allowed operators to override the safety system when production quotas got tight. I'd written 3 separate reports about this modification, each one explicitly stating that bypassing safety interlocks violated multiple OSHA standards and created an imminent danger to workers. Marcus had assured me each time that maintenance would address the issue when they had adequate staffing. Station 5 housed our chemical treatment tanks, where metal components underwent various surface preparation processes involving solutions that required specific ventilation, personal protective equipment, and waste disposal procedures. Over the past month, I'd observed operators working without proper respiratory protection, inadequate ventilation during peak production periods, and chemical waste being disposed of through channels that didn't match what our environmental compliance documentation claimed we were doing. I documented all of this naturally. Real men, it seemed, were remarkably thorough when it came to creating paperwork trails. The conveyor system that connected our various workstations had been showing signs of mechanical stress for months, with several safety guards either missing entirely or modified in ways that allowed easier access to moving parts, but also created pinch point hazards. Our lockout-tagout procedures for maintenance on this system had become increasingly casual, with workers sometimes skipping steps when production schedules made proper safety protocols seem like luxury expenses. Each violation by itself might have resulted in a standard citation and fine. Combined together, with proper documentation of management's awareness and deliberate indifference, they painted a picture of systematic safety failures that federal inspectors tend to take quite seriously. The beauty of working in manufacturing for 15 years is that you develop relationships with people throughout the industry. People who understand safety requirements. People who know which agencies take anonymous tips seriously. People who can provide guidance on the most effective way to ensure that safety violations receive appropriate attention from the right authorities. I spent my lunch break that day making some phone calls. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration operates on the principle that workers have a right to a safe workplace and that employers have a legal obligation to provide one. When they receive complaints about safety violations, particularly complaints that include specific details about hazards and management's knowledge of those hazards, they're required to investigate within certain timeframes depending on the severity of the reported conditions. Anonymous complaints about imminent danger situations receive the highest priority. I'd never filed an OSHA complaint before, but I discovered the process was remarkably straightforward. Their online complaint form requested detailed information about specific hazards, the location of those hazards, how long the conditions had existed, and whether management was aware of the problems. For each section, I had comprehensive documentation. The hydraulic press safety bypass. I provided the exact location, the date the bypass was installed, copies of my incident reports, and details about Marcus's responses to those reports. I explained how the bypass allowed operators to override safety systems, creating crush hazards and caught-in hazards that violated specific OSHA standards. The chemical treatment area. I documented the inadequate ventilation, improper waste disposal, and lack of required personal protective equipment. I provided details about air quality during peak production periods and explained how operators were being exposed to chemicals above permissible exposure limits. The conveyor system hazards. I listed each missing or modified safety guard, described the pinch points and caught-in hazards these modifications created, and detailed how our lockout-tagout procedures had deteriorated to the point where workers were regularly exposed to unexpected energization of equipment during maintenance activities. For each hazard category, I attached copies of my formal reports to management and documented the responses I'd received. The pattern was consistent. Safety concerns identified, management informed, corrective action deferred indefinitely while production continued under hazardous conditions. OSHA's complaint form also asked whether I wanted the inspection to be conducted with or without my identity being revealed to the employer. Given Marcus's views on workplace complaints, I selected the anonymous option. 3 days later, I received a phone call informing me that my complaint had been assigned to a compliance officer and that an inspection would be conducted within the next 2 weeks. The caller explained that because my complaint involved potential imminent danger situations, the inspection would be unannounced and comprehensive. I thanked them for the information and continued my normal work routine, maintaining the same level of professional competence and attention to detail that had characterized my entire career at Pinnacle Manufacturing. The only difference was that now I was documenting everything with even greater precision, knowing that someone with enforcement authority would soon be reviewing our actual practices against our stated policies. The interesting thing about waiting for a federal safety inspection is how normal everything continues to seem on the surface. Production quotas remained the same. Management pressure remained the same. The safety shortcuts that had become routine practice continued exactly as they had been, because changing them would have required acknowledging that problems existed in the first place. Marcus held our weekly supervisory meeting 4 days after I'd filed the OSHA complaint, and his main agenda item was increasing production efficiency across all stations. He'd received pressure from corporate about meeting quarterly targets, and he needed each workstation to find ways to reduce cycle times while maintaining quality standards. When I asked about the maintenance backlog that was affecting several critical safety systems, he reminded me that real supervisors find ways to work within existing constraints rather than creating excuses about equipment limitations. I took detailed notes during this meeting. Real men apparently were quite diligent about meeting documentation. Station 3 continued operating with its safety interlock bypass, allowing operators to override the light curtain system whenever production demands made safety protocols inconvenient. I observed this happening an average of 12 times per shift during the week following my OSHA complaint, and I documented each incident with precise timestamps and descriptions of the safety violations involved. The chemical treatment area in Station 5 continued operating with inadequate ventilation during peak production periods, and operators continued working without proper respiratory protection. I began tracking air quality during these periods using a portable monitor I'd borrowed from our environmental compliance office, recording readings that consistently exceeded permissible exposure limits for several chemicals we used in our surface treatment processes. Our conveyor system continued operating with missing safety guards and modified protective barriers, creating pinch point hazards and caught-in hazards throughout the production floor. Workers continued performing maintenance on this system without following proper lockout-tagout procedures, a practice that had become so routine that most operators seemed unaware they were violating federal safety standards every time they cleaned or adjusted moving equipment without properly de-energizing it first. Each day brought new examples of the same patterns I'd been documenting for months, except now I was recording everything with the knowledge that someone with enforcement authority would soon be evaluating our actual practices against federal safety requirements. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after I'd filed my complaint. Marcus received it in his office around 9:30, and within minutes the tone of his voice carried clearly across the production floor, even though I couldn't make out his specific words. 20 minutes later, he appeared at my workstation with an expression I'd never seen before on his face. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration would be conducting an unannounced inspection of our facility beginning in approximately 1 hour. Corporate had been notified, and they were sending their safety coordinator to assist with the inspection process. Marcus needed me to ensure that all operations in my sections were running according to our documented safety procedures. I assured him that my areas had always operated according to documented safety procedures, which was technically accurate even though our documented procedures bore little resemblance to our actual practices. The beauty of that statement was how it placed responsibility for any discrepancies exactly where it belonged, with management decisions about how those procedures would be implemented. Marcus spent the next hour moving frantically between workstations, having urgent conversations with operators about proper safety protocols and equipment usage. He instructed maintenance to prioritize any outstanding safety-related work orders, regardless of production impact. He reminded everyone about the importance of following all documented procedures during the inspection period. Watching him attempt to address in 60 minutes the safety issues I'd been documenting for months provided a certain professional satisfaction that I kept carefully concealed behind my usual composed demeanor. The OSHA compliance officer arrived precisely when scheduled, accompanied by an industrial hygienist and a safety engineer. They presented their credentials to Marcus and requested copies of our safety documentation, including our hazard communication program, lockout-tagout procedures, personal protective equipment policies, and records of any workplace injuries or illnesses from the past year. While Marcus gathered the requested documentation, the inspection team began their walkthrough of the production floor, starting with Station 1 and proceeding systematically through each work area. I continued my normal supervisory duties, maintaining professional composure while observing how federal safety inspectors approach their evaluation of workplace hazards. Their methodology was thorough and systematic. They examined each piece of equipment, reviewed safety procedures, interviewed operators about their training and practices, and compared actual conditions against regulatory requirements. They photographed everything, took measurements of noise levels and air quality, and documented every safety guard, warning label, and protective device they encountered. When they reached Station 3, they immediately identified the hydraulic press safety bypass and spent considerable time examining the modification, photographing it from multiple angles, and interviewing the operators about how and when they used the override function. The compliance officer made extensive notes about the bypass system and requested documentation about when it had been installed and who had authorized its use. Marcus provided what documentation he could locate, but it became apparent that the bypass modification had been implemented without proper engineering review or management approval. The records showed that maintenance had installed it in response to production concerns, but there was no evidence that anyone had evaluated the safety implications or ensured compliance with federal standards. The inspection team's examination of the chemical treatment area in Station 5 revealed multiple violations related to ventilation, personal protective equipment, and exposure monitoring. The industrial hygienist conducted air quality measurements that confirmed what I'd been documenting. Chemical exposures routinely exceeded permissible limits during peak production periods, and operators were not being provided with adequate respiratory protection. Their review of our chemical waste disposal practices identified several discrepancies between our documented procedures and our actual practices, including improper labeling, inadequate containment, and disposal methods that didn't match what our environmental compliance documentation claimed we were doing. The conveyor system inspection revealed extensive safety guard violations, improper lockout-tagout practices, and multiple pinch point hazards that had been created by modifications designed to improve production efficiency rather than worker safety. The safety engineer documented each missing or modified guard, measured clearance distances around moving equipment, and interviewed workers about their maintenance and cleaning procedures. Throughout the inspection process, the OSHA team maintained professional demeanor while conducting their evaluation, but their questions became increasingly pointed as they uncovered the systematic nature of the safety violations throughout our facility. They requested documentation about management's knowledge of various hazards, including any incident reports, safety meetings, or corrective actions that might have addressed the conditions they were observing. Marcus provided copies of various safety-related documents, including several of my incident reports from the past few months. The compliance officer reviewed these reports carefully, noting the dates they had been submitted, the specific hazards they had identified, and the responses management had provided. By mid-afternoon, the inspection team had documented safety violations in every major work area of our facility. They had identified imminent danger conditions, serious safety violations, and systematic failures in our safety management systems. They had interviewed dozens of workers, photographed hundreds of hazards, and accumulated evidence of management's knowledge and deliberate indifference to worker safety. The closing conference took place in Marcus's office at 4:30 that afternoon. Corporate's safety coordinator had arrived by then, along with the plant manager and the human resources director. The OSHA compliance officer presented their preliminary findings, which included multiple serious violations, several willful violations based on management's documented knowledge of hazards, and at least 2 imminent danger situations that required immediate corrective action. The hydraulic press bypass system constituted a willful violation because management had been repeatedly informed about the safety hazard through formal incident reports, yet had chosen to continue operating the equipment in violation of federal safety standards. The bypass system created imminent danger to workers and would need to be disconnected immediately, with the press remaining out of service until proper safety systems were restored. The chemical treatment area violations included serious citations for inadequate ventilation, improper personal protective equipment, and failure to conduct required exposure monitoring. The air quality measurements taken during the inspection had confirmed exposures above permissible limits, requiring immediate implementation of engineering controls and respiratory protection programs. The conveyor system violations included multiple serious citations for missing safety guards, inadequate lockout-tagout procedures, and failure to provide proper training on hazard recognition and control. Several of these violations were also classified as willful, based on the documented evidence that management had been aware of the hazards, but had failed to take corrective action. The total proposed penalties exceeded $200,000, with additional requirements for comprehensive safety program improvements, worker training, and follow-up inspections to ensure compliance with corrective action requirements. Marcus sat quietly throughout the closing conference, occasionally asking questions about specific violations or penalty amounts, but mostly listening as the compliance officer explained the scope of the safety failures they had identified. The corporate safety coordinator took extensive notes and asked about appeal procedures and timeline requirements for corrective actions. When the OSHA team finished their presentation and left the facility, Marcus called a meeting with all supervisory staff to discuss the inspection results and begin planning corrective actions. He explained that corporate was taking the violations very seriously and that significant resources would be allocated to address the safety deficiencies identified during the inspection. He also mentioned that they would be conducting an internal investigation to determine how these safety issues had developed and why they hadn't been adequately addressed through normal management channels. The investigation would include a review of all incident reports and safety documentation from the past year, with particular attention to any communications that might have provided early warning about the violations OSHA had identified. I nodded professionally and assured him that I would provide any documentation or information needed to support the investigation. After 15 years with the company, I understood the importance of thorough documentation in addressing complex operational challenges, The following week brought a series of changes that transformed the culture of our production floor, more dramatically than any safety initiative I'd witnessed during my entire career at Pinnacle Manufacturing. Corporate safety engineers arrived to oversee corrective actions. Equipment was shut down for safety modifications. Work practices were revised to ensure compliance with federal standards. The hydraulic press remained out of service while maintenance technicians removed the safety bypass system and restored proper interlock functionality. Production quotas for Station 3 were adjusted to accommodate the additional time required for proper safety procedures, with corporate explicitly stating that safety compliance took priority over production efficiency. The chemical treatment area received comprehensive ventilation upgrades, new personal protective equipment, and implementation of air quality monitoring programs that would ensure worker exposures remained within permissible limits. Operators received additional training on proper protective equipment usage and chemical handling procedures. The conveyor system underwent extensive safety modifications, with proper guards installed on all moving parts, comprehensive lockout-tagout procedures implemented, and detailed training provided to all workers who perform maintenance or cleaning activities on the equipment. Marcus approached me during the second week of corrective actions, explaining that corporate had reviewed all safety documentation from the past year as part of their internal investigation. They had noted the comprehensive incident reports I had submitted regarding the violations OSHA had identified, and they wanted to recognize my efforts to address safety concerns through proper channels. The interesting thing about that conversation was how carefully Marcus chose his words. He acknowledged that my reports had provided early warning about the safety issues OSHA had cited. He recognized that proper attention to those reports might have prevented some of the violations from developing. He expressed appreciation for my diligence in documenting safety concerns and following established reporting procedures. What he didn't say, but what we both understood, was that dismissing those concerns as complaints from someone who wasn't man enough to work around problems had cost the company more than $200,000 in penalties, plus additional hundreds of thousands in corrective action expenses, plus immeasurable damage to their safety reputation with regulators. Corporate offered me a position as facility safety coordinator, with responsibility for oversight of safety programs across all production areas and direct reporting authority to the plant manager rather than through department supervisors. The position included a significant salary increase and explicit authority to halt production operations when safety concerns required immediate attention. I accepted the position with the same professional composure I'd maintained throughout my career at Pinnacle Manufacturing, expressing appreciation for the opportunity to contribute to improved safety performance and worker protection. The OSHA follow-up inspection took place 6 months later with the same compliance officer who had conducted the original investigation. By then, our safety systems had been transformed completely. Equipment operated with proper safety interlocks. Chemical exposures remained within permissible limits. Lockout-tagout procedures were followed meticulously. Workers received comprehensive safety training and had access to appropriate protective equipment. Most importantly, safety concerns were addressed immediately when they were identified, regardless of production impact or cost considerations. The culture had shifted from viewing safety requirements as obstacles to efficiency toward viewing them as fundamental operational requirements that enabled sustainable productivity. The compliance officer noted these improvements in their follow-up report, commending the facility for implementing comprehensive corrective actions that went beyond minimum compliance requirements. Several of the original violations were downgraded based on the demonstrated commitment to safety improvement, though the willful violation penalties remained in place as a reminder of the consequences of deliberate indifference to worker safety. Marcus remained as production manager, but his authority over safety-related decisions had been transferred to my new position as safety coordinator. Our working relationship became professionally cordial, focused on coordinating production activities with safety requirements, rather than debating whether safety concerns deserved management attention. The interesting dynamic was how Marcus began bringing safety issues to my attention proactively, seeking guidance on proper procedures, rather than dismissing concerns as inconvenient obstacles. His conversion to safety advocacy seemed genuine, probably motivated by his clear understanding of the consequences that resulted from his previous approach to workplace hazards. 6 months after the OSHA inspection, I received a letter from the compliance officer thanking me for the anonymous complaint that had initiated their investigation. The letter explained that my detailed documentation had enabled them to conduct a thorough inspection and identify systematic safety failures that might otherwise have continued until someone was seriously injured. The letter also mentioned that anonymous complaints from knowledgeable workers were often their most effective tool for identifying serious safety hazards because workers understood the actual conditions and practices better than anyone else in the organization. They encouraged continued vigilance and communication about safety concerns that might require regulatory attention. I filed the letter in my personal records, along with copies of all the incident reports I had submitted before the inspection and copies of all the corrective action documentation that had been implemented afterward. Professional vindication, I discovered, was best documented comprehensively. The transformation at Pinnacle Manufacturing extended beyond simple compliance with federal safety requirements. Our injury rates dropped to historic lows. Workers reported increased confidence in management's commitment to their protection. Production efficiency actually improved once safety systems were functioning properly, and workers could focus on their tasks without concern about workplace hazards. Corporate began using our facility as a model for safety program implementation at their other locations, with delegations visiting regularly to observe our safety systems and learn from our experience. Marcus found himself presenting our safety transformation story at industry conferences, explaining how comprehensive safety programs could improve both worker protection and operational efficiency. The irony of Marcus becoming a safety advocate based on his experience with federal regulatory enforcement was not lost on me, though I maintained professional discretion about the circumstances that had initiated that transformation. Real professionals, I'd learned, achieved their objectives through systematic documentation and appropriate regulatory channels, rather than through confrontational approaches that created unnecessary workplace friction. My role as safety coordinator expanded over the following year to include responsibility for environmental compliance, regulatory affairs, and worker training programs. Corporate recognized that systematic attention to regulatory requirements could prevent costly violations while improving operational efficiency, and they invested in building comprehensive compliance capabilities throughout their organization. The position provided professional satisfaction that went beyond simple career advancement. Every day brought opportunities to prevent injuries, improve working conditions, and ensure that workers could return home safely to their families. The technical challenges of designing effective safety systems and implementing regulatory compliance programs utilized skills I developed over 15 years in manufacturing operations. More importantly, the position demonstrated that expertise and professional competence would ultimately be recognized and valued, even in organizations where short-term thinking sometimes overshadowed long-term strategic considerations. Patience, documentation, and appropriate use of regulatory channels had proven more effective than confrontational approaches or emotional responses to management indifference. The annual OSHA inspection became a routine event rather than a crisis situation. Compliance officers found comprehensive safety programs, well-maintained equipment, and workers who understood both their rights and their responsibilities regarding workplace safety. Our facility moved from the high-priority inspection category to the routine compliance monitoring category, reflecting our demonstrated commitment to maintaining federal safety standards. Marcus and I developed an effective working relationship based on mutual recognition of our respective expertise and responsibilities. He understood production operations and efficiency requirements. I understood regulatory compliance and safety system design. Together, we could optimize both productivity and worker protection in ways that neither of us could have achieved independently. The professional lesson from this experience wasn't about revenge or vindication in the traditional sense. It was about understanding that true expertise will ultimately prove its value, regardless of how that expertise is initially received by management. Workers who understand their operations better than anyone else have both the knowledge and the tools to ensure that safety requirements receive appropriate attention from authorities with enforcement capability. Documentation proved to be the critical factor in transforming workplace concerns into regulatory action. Detailed incident reports, precise hazard descriptions, and evidence of management's knowledge created the foundation for effective regulatory intervention. Anonymous complaint procedures provided protection for workers who might otherwise face retaliation for raising safety concerns through external channels. The OSHA inspection process demonstrated that federal safety regulations exist specifically to protect workers when internal management systems fail to address legitimate safety concerns. Compliance officers understand the difference between routine workplace complaints and systematic safety failures that require immediate regulatory attention. They have both the expertise and the authority to evaluate workplace conditions against objective federal standards. Most importantly, the experience confirmed that workers have both the right and the responsibility to ensure that their workplace meets federal safety requirements. When internal reporting channels prove ineffective, external regulatory resources provide both protection and enforcement capabilities that can transform workplace culture more effectively than years of internal advocacy. Real men, I learned, document everything comprehensively, follow appropriate regulatory procedures systematically, and allow federal enforcement agencies to determine whether workplace conditions meet the standards that protect workers from serious injury or death. They understand that professional competence includes knowing when and how to access external resources that can address safety concerns more effectively than internal management systems. The transformation at Pinnacle Manufacturing became a case study in how regulatory enforcement can drive systematic improvements in workplace safety culture. Our experience demonstrated that comprehensive compliance with federal safety standards could improve both worker protection and operational efficiency, creating sustainable competitive advantages for organizations that invested in proper safety system design and implementation. Corporate expanded my responsibilities to include oversight of safety programs at their other manufacturing facilities, recognizing that regulatory compliance expertise had become a critical business capability in an environment where safety violations could result in significant financial penalties and operational disruptions. The position provided opportunities to prevent similar safety failures at other locations, while developing industry-leading safety management systems. The professional satisfaction from this work extended far beyond personal career advancement. Every safety system implemented, every hazard eliminated, every worker training program delivered contributed to the fundamental goal of ensuring that people could perform their jobs without risk of serious injury. The technical challenges of designing effective safety programs and implementing regulatory compliance systems provided opportunities to utilize engineering knowledge, management skills, and regulatory expertise in ways that created measurable value for both workers and organizations. Years later, when I reflect on that morning when Marcus explained how real men handle workplace challenges, I recognize it as one of the most important moments in my professional development. His dismissal of legitimate safety concerns as complaints from someone who wasn't tough enough to work around problems provided the clarity I needed to understand exactly what kind of documentation would be most useful to federal safety inspectors. The subsequent OSHA investigation, regulatory enforcement action, and safety transformation at Pinnacle Manufacturing confirmed that systematic attention to regulatory compliance could achieve workplace improvements that internal advocacy alone might never have accomplished. Professional competence, properly documented and presented to appropriate authorities, proved more effective than years of internal reporting through management channels that prioritize production efficiency over worker protection. Real men, it turned out, understood that federal safety regulations existed specifically to protect workers from exactly the kinds of systematic safety failures that internal management systems sometimes failed to address adequately. They also understood that anonymous complaint procedures provided both protection and effectiveness for workers who possessed the knowledge and documentation needed to facilitate comprehensive regulatory inspections. The experience taught me that professional vindication often arrives through channels that recognize expertise rather than through confrontational approaches that create unnecessary workplace conflict. Workers who understand their operations better than anyone else have access to regulatory resources that can evaluate workplace conditions against objective federal standards, regardless of how those concerns are initially received by internal management systems. Most importantly, the transformation at Pinnacle Manufacturing demonstrated that comprehensive safety compliance could improve both worker protection and operational efficiency, creating sustainable value for organizations that invested in proper safety system design and regulatory compliance programs. The technical challenges and professional satisfaction from this work continue to provide opportunities for meaningful contribution to worker protection and organizational excellence. Today, when I encounter workers who are struggling with safety concerns that aren't receiving adequate attention through internal reporting channels, I share what I learned about documentation procedures, regulatory complaint processes, and the resources available through federal enforcement agencies. Real professionals understand that protecting workers from serious injury sometimes requires accessing external expertise an authority that can evaluate workplace conditions more effectively than internal management systems. The transformation continues, facility by facility, through systematic application of regulatory compliance expertise and comprehensive safety program implementation. Each workplace improvement, each hazard elimination, each safety training program contributes to the fundamental goal of ensuring that workers can return home safely to their families every day. Professional competence, properly applied through appropriate regulatory channels, remains the most effective tool for addressing systematic safety failures and creating workplace cultures that prioritize both productivity and protection. Documentation, patience, and strategic use of federal enforcement resources continue to provide more sustainable results than confrontational approaches or emotional responses to management indifference. Real men, I learned, understand exactly when and how to ensure that workplace safety concerns receive the attention they deserve from authorities with both expertise and enforcement capability. They also understand that professional vindication comes through systematic demonstration of competence rather than through revenge fantasies or confrontational workplace dynamics. The work continues, one safety system at a time, one regulatory compliance program at a time, one workplace transformation at a time. Professional satisfaction comes from knowing that expertise and competence will ultimately prove their value, creating safer workplaces and protecting workers from the systematic safety failures that federal regulations were specifically designed to prevent.